The train breathed like a tired animal as it groaned to a stop at Ash River Station, its iron ribs ticking in the early heat. Zoya Markova stood on the platform in the pale dress she had sewn from leftovers of another woman's life. Lace from a widow's trunk, satin cut from a charity bolt, her gloved hands hidden in the folds as though she could hide her heart there too. She had traveled weeks to the edge of the map with a name and a promise. Harlan Quinn, carpenter and widower, honest, steady, sober. On paper, he had sounded like a bridge over deep water. In Zoya's mind, he had become a shore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. Steam folded over the platform, a warm breath that smelled faintly of coal and oranges someone had dropped in a basket. Zoya lifted her chin the way her mother had taught her to do when seas were rough and cabins smaller than grief. She had not sailed so many miles to be timid at the last. Still, her stomach curled when she saw the town spread low under the hills, boardwalks like narrow tongues, a church steeple that had the look of a pointing finger, a river that braided light along its own spine. A boy coughed in the distance and was yanked by the wrist by his mother. That cough was common enough. It was summer. The dust was thick. Zoya told herself not to stare. Harlan Quinn stood at the end of the platform, in a jacket that didn't hide how square his shoulders were. He seemed carved rather than made, a man who knew how to make a wall true. His eyes startled her, the color of creek glass, pale but not cold. He removed his hat, dust fell like a blessing gone astray. "Miss Markova," he said carefully, as if the syllables cost something and he wanted to pay exactly the right amount. "Welcome to Ash River." She tried the name in her mouth. Ash River. It felt like a promise and a warning. "Mr. Quinn." "Harlan, if that suits." His mouth dipped, not quite a smile. Close up, she saw the hint of old grief at the corners of his eyes, lines that swerved when he blinked, as if his gaze had learned the habit of skirting certain rooms of memory. "You'll be wanting shade." Shade was the cottonwood by the end of Main Street, and a glass of water poured from a blue-tinted jar at the boarding house. The landlady, Mrs. Keeler, spoke without commas, her words braided end to end like rope. "We heard you come in on the 10:30. I told Harlan, I said she'll be worn thin as a thread and hungry as a hunting dog. Sit down, girl, sit down." Zoya did, hands on the tin cup to keep them from shaking out the last of the train's rhythm. "I have a room for you," Harlan said, standing like a doorframe, straight and durable. "We'll speak with Reverend Cray about the details. If it sits right with you, we can make it quick. I know traveling can pull a person hollow." Zoya thought of the trunk under her feet on the train nights, the way the wood hummed with rail song, all those minor vibrations finding the hollow places in her and making them sing back. "Quick is good," she said. She wanted a roof with her name on it. She wanted a name that could not be taken away by papers or men who mistook kindness for permission. On the way to the church, they passed the general store. A sign in the window read, "Camp, Fever in Cedar Fork. Keep clean, boil water." Zoya stopped. "Fever?" she asked, and heard the carefulness in her own voice, the way she kept panic wrapped in linen and tucked in the bottom of a drawer. Harlan followed her gaze. "There's talk," he said. "Word from Cedar Fork 2 days ago. Some say it's summer complaint, some say worse. Dr. Merritt's been writing more." He studied her, as if weighing whether this would send her back to the train. "I won't shirk," he added, almost defensively, as if she had accused him. "The town's got sense. We'll take precautions." "I know precautions," Zoya said. "My mother." The sentence faltered. Images rose. Her mother boiling linens in their St. Petersburg kitchen, steam fogging the windows, a neighborhood lined with black crepe and the sound of flies like small black bells. Zoya tasted the copper of old fear and set the memory down before it could burn her fingertips. "We should boil water." "We will. We're not Cedar Fork." Ash River's church had fresh paint, a hopeful white that made Zoya think of a new tooth. Inside, Reverend Amos Cray had the face of a man who laughed seldom and kept his sermons long because he believed length could replace whatever else was missing. His wife, Prudence, had a mouth like a ruler. When Zoya and Harlan explained what they wanted, quiet vows, simple supper, a ring if a ring could be afforded, Prudence's gaze took inventory of Zoya's dress, her accent, the calluses along the fingers where needles had lived. "Mail order," she said, not unkindly, but not kindly either, like a label on a jar that didn't quite fit. "Bride," Harlan answered, and something warm and defiant moved through Zoya, a small blue flame that liked Harlan Quinn more than she had a moment before. "Saturday will do," Reverend Cry said, shuffling papers. 2 o'clock. God likes an afternoon wedding, gives him the morning to prepare a blessing. Zoya bowed her head. She was not sure how blessings were prepared, but she knew how to thread needles in low light, how to mend a hem so that its strength hid in the stitches. She could share her skills with the town that would become hers. That thought steadied her until they reached the boardwalk again, and she heard that cough, wet, low, a sound like a kettle beginning to boil. The coughing boy again, red-cheeked and glassy-eyed now, his mother tugging him toward the alley where the physician kept a tidy office with a slate out front. Dr. Silas Merritt, Physic, Surgery, Delivery. The chalk had smeared, as if written by a hand already moving to the next urgent thing. Harlan's jaw hardened. "He'll take you by the river after," he said. "Cool your head. It's something I do when the town gets loud." Zoya almost told him that in cities, noise was like oxygen, but she let the words go. The river would be good. Rivers had taught her their trick. Keep moving, and you will not mildew in place. They walked in a float of silence to the water. The Ash River lived up to its name, a gray-green ribbon that made a soft speaking sound against stones. A small camp stood a ways upriver. 3 lodges, laundry like flags, smoke rising in a clean blue line. Harlan nodded toward it. "Lakota families summer there," he said. "Trade berries, tanned hides, basketry. Some years they're here longer, if the hunting or the peace runs thin elsewhere. We keep respectful. They do the same." Zoya's eyes traced the slope of sky meeting hill. She could make a life inside such a horizon, she thought, even if her mouth still tugged vowels from a far sea. "Respect," she said softly, thinking of a woman across the waterline wringing a blanket the same way Zoya's mother had. Hands sure, wrists like thin iron. The woman lifted her gaze and met Zoya's. A small nod traveled the distance between them, a small bridge, laid down and walked over without words. That night, Zoya didn't sleep. She listened to Ash River breathe. Through the boarding house wall came a lullaby in a language she didn't know, and the steady wheeze of the landlady's husband. From the alley came footsteps going nowhere in particular. Zoya lay awake and watched moonlight find the framed photograph on the dressing table. Her mother at 20, alive in black and white, a thin smile pinned to her mouth like a brooch. "I am trying," Zoya whispered. In the photograph, her mother's eyes were polite and unhelpful. In the morning, Zoya bought needles and thread from the general store in a length of muslin thin as mist. The shopkeeper, Tansy Bellamy, liked to talk and liked to count change slowly to make talking stretch. "You'll be Mrs. Quinn, then?" Tansy said, though it wasn't a question. "We are a town that sets its tables promptly. I can have you a pie by Saturday if you put your name down. Folks expect pie." "Pie is good for expecting," Zoya said, and Tansy squinted as if humor were a trick played on her ears. On Thursday, the bell at the church tolled at an hour that was not Sunday, and not an hour any wedding would want. Zoya startled hard enough to prick her finger. A jewel of her blood bloomed on the muslin. She wiped it quickly with her mouth and tasted iron. On Main Street, Reverend Cray set a sign on the church steps, "Keep clean, wash hands, boil water." Dr. Merritt tied a red scrap to the post outside his office, a signal Zoya had seen in port towns and narrow cities. Caution, contagion, the river's dark twin. People began to speak in doorways with the careful distance of those who want to hear and not be heard. Cedar Fork had 3 dead, then 5, all in the same street. Zoya kept her breathing regular the way her mother had taught her, smooth, like thread, sliding through cloth. "Is it cholera?" she asked Dr. Merritt when she delivered a basket of boiled rags to his office, an offering that felt both inadequate and the only thing she could think to do. The doctor was a compact man whose hair seemed always on the brink of remembering to gray. "I don't believe so," he said, tired and honest. "Fever runs high, rash after, the kind that raises rather than fades. Smallpox would be my first suspicion. I'm heading to Cedar Fork to confirm. We've some vaccine, not enough." The words hung in the room like flies.
"Vaccinate," Zoya said, hearing her own certainty as if it came from a place older than she was. "What you can, whom you can." "We will. We'll also need calm. Panic spreads faster than anything I've ever seen." He glanced at the rags in her arms, at the neatness of her binding. "You sew?" "I make things hold," Zoya said simply. "Good. If it comes here, we'll need hands that know how to bind in a way that doesn't come undone." His eyes softened. "And we'll need courage, Ms. Markova. I know you didn't come to America to become a nurse." The words snagged Zoya. She had not come to become anything but safe. Yet the picture rose in her mind unbidden. A dress torn into strips, white turned to use. Hands folding cool cloths. Voices lowered in a room that had learned to be still. She felt both frightened and ready, a combination that felt to her like stepping onto a ship. By Friday, the cough in town had learned new notes. It was joined by a heat behind the eyes and a weakness that made people sit where they did not plan to sit. Dr. Merritt rode back from Cedar Fork with shirt sleeves rolled, eyes rimmed red, and a voice that didn't waste syllables. "Smallpox," he said to the gathered men on the boardwalk, Harlan among them, Reverend Cray, Sheriff Calder, and a scattering of merchants who believed money could make walls against the wind. "Quarantine of the ill, vaccination where we can, prayer if you're inclined. We close the school, and we keep the church for care. We post watchers at the road. We do not," and here he looked at Sheriff Calder Hart, "burn anyone's house down." No one said they had thought of fire. The air, however, smelled faintly of kindling. Harlan's hand found Zoya's elbow in the crowd, a touch so careful she nearly cried. "We'll do what's needed," he said to her, low. "But Saturday is still Saturday. I can be a husband and a helper. It's allowed to be both." Zoya looked at her hands, the half-moons of sawdust that had found hiding places in her cuticles, the scars of honest work. She had promised herself she would not marry a man's hands if she could not bear his voice. Harlan's voice mattered more in that moment than any ring. "Yes," she heard herself say, and she was not entirely sure to which part of the sentence she was agreeing. Saturday morning came with sky overpolished and insects that sang too loud. Zoya's dress hung from the curtain rod like a pale argument. She stared at it while pinning her hair into a crown that would not wobble. The fabric did not look like other girls' dresses she had seen in shop windows. It was smaller at the waist because she had learned hunger as a language and could speak it with her bones. It flared modestly because she could not imagine a parade. She had embroidered the hem with tiny wheat stalks, almost invisible to a casual eye. Her small reminder that even in a dry place, something green could grow. When the bell tolled noon, Zoya walked to the church with Mrs. Keeler and a bouquet of wild things the landlady had cut with a kitchen knife. Yarrow, wild rose, a purple flower none of them could name. A child ran past with a tin pail, sloshing water onto her stockings. Laughter chased him, but ended uncomfortably, a cough strangling it from behind. Zoya kept walking. Inside the church, the air was cool and smelled of lemon oil. Harlan stood by the front with a ring he had made himself from a strip of soft gold coaxed into a circle so true it made Zoya's throat hurt. Reverend Cray's Bible lay open, one page wrinkled as if it had been worried by a thumb. Prudence Cray watched from the first pew, as if a wedding were a test, and she had a pencil in her lap. Reverend Cray began. The first words lifted her like a raft. It felt possible. Marriage like a small vessel, sturdy enough to cross rough places. Zoya lowered her eyes to the hem of her dress, to the tiny wheat stalk she'd stitched, and breathed when she felt her chest pull tight. The doors burst inward before the vow could be named. Mrs. Bellamy from the general store stood in the doorway in an apron wide enough to make Zoya blink. Behind her, a man sagged between two others, his face a map of panic and heat. "Dr. Merritt!" she shouted to the room at large, as if churches kept him on a high shelf. Dr. Merritt stepped from the back pew where he had stood like a shadow out of respect and preparedness. He was at the man's side in 3 strides. "Get him to the rectory," he ordered. "We'll make that our first room. Reverend, your spare linens. Mrs. Bellamy, fetch vinegar, soap, your biggest pot. Sheriff?" "On it," Sheriff Calder said, his voice too loud, the way men make their voices when they're afraid of silence. Harlan looked at Zoya. Nothing in his face asked permission because the permission was obvious. "Go," Zoya said, before he could feel the need to ask. "I'll follow." And then, because she recognized what she was doing within herself, holding tight and letting go with the same hand, she added, "We will not lose him." She did not say which him she meant. Orrin, Harlan, the town, the idea that Saturday could still be a day that held a vow. In the small kitchen behind the church, Zoya found herself moving without thinking. She filled the big pot and set it to boil. She folded clean cloths as if folding hope. Dr. Merritt worked with fine-boned briskness, 2 steps ahead of where his hands were, as if his body knew how to be 3 places at once and his mind had learned to forgive it when it couldn't. "We'll isolate the worst cases," he said, not looking up. "Cool compresses. Keep them drinking if we can. Do not let them scratch. We'll see who's been vaccinated recently and give what we can to the rest." "What do you need?" Zoya asked. "Clean," he said, "and courage. You've the look of someone who knows both." She thought of a winter in another country, where the city had howled and the floors had felt cold as iron. She thought of her mother's hands, raw and resolute. "I will do what comes," she said. They laid Orrin on the rectory's bed, and the first thing Zoya noticed were the heat and the smell, like iron and something sour, the human body working too hard. His skin shone, his eyes had the glassy look of someone partway between rooms. A rash stippled his hairline, small constellations breaking the surface of his skin. He moaned and tried to roll. Dr. Merritt's hand on his shoulder was firm and kind. "Easy," he said. "You'll ride this out better if you stay still." Reverend Cray's spare linens turned out to be a meager stack, and most of them too fine to dirty without a protest that would cost time Zoya did not think anyone could afford. She looked at her own dress, the work, the stitching, the way it fit her heart like a question she had almost learned to answer. She looked at Orrin's skin. She felt something in her rise like a tide. "Mrs. Keeler," Zoya said, surprising herself with the sound of command in her throat, "fetch my trunk from the boarding house." "For what?" the landlady asked, already moving. "The muslin and my dressmaking shears." When the trunk arrived, Zoya knelt one last time to feel the fabric of her wedding dress. It was cool under her palms, the lace had the delicate stubbornness of spiderwork. She thought of the moment Harlan had first taken off his hat, dust falling like small blessings. She thought of the curve of a ring shaped by a carpenter's patience. She thought of Orrin's mother, of the boy with the tin pail, of the camp upriver with laundry hanging like flags declaring that life would go on. Then she set the dress across her knees and slid the shears into the seam at the hem. The sound of cutting was shockingly loud, like a window breaking. Zoya did not flinch. She cut bands as wide as her palm, then narrower strips, then squares for compresses. Lace, satin, muslin, all translated into usefulness. White became purpose. Prudence Cray stood in the doorway, mouth opening to shape disapproval, and then closing again when she saw the steadiness in Zoya's hands. "God sees sacrifice," she said after a moment, but the words sounded less like doctrine and more like someone trying to keep her balance on a moving floor. Harlan appeared at the threshold, shirt sleeves rolled, hair damp from effort or worry, perhaps both. His eyes moved from the pile of white strips to Zoya's face. He did not ask a question. He did not need to. He reached for the shears not to take them, but to steady the box they rested in. "Show me how to make the edges so they don't rub," he said, and Zoya fell in love with that sentence as hard as she had ever fallen in her life. By evening, the rectory had become a ward. Reverend Cray carried benches with a grunt that sounded almost like prayer. The pew's glossy backs leaned against the walls, making room for pallets. Women boiled water and cooled it with patience. Men carried buckets and tried not to look braver than they felt. The church bell rang 3 patient notes after sundown, a signal agreed upon at the meeting Dr. Merritt had called on the boardwalk. Come if you can work, stay home if you are ill, swallow fear, and do the next thing. Zoya walked among the beds with a basket on her arm. Vinegar rags, folded strips, a jar of camphor, a tin cup for water. She learned names the way a seamstress learns stitches. Orrin, Clara, John, Millie, Mrs. Phelps, who owned the boarding house 2 owners before Mrs. Keeler. Old Mr. Finch, who still polished his spectacles every hour as if that could make the world precise enough to understand what was happening. The sound of suffering layered itself into a music that had rhythm. Breaths, moans, the clink of a spoon against a cup, the soft hiss of the lantern, and over it all the river's distant talking of stones.
Near midnight, a woman appeared at the back door with a basket that smelled clean and green. She stood for a moment in the threshold, like a piece of the night that had decided to enter. Zoya recognized her from the river, a woman whose presence was not tall but seemed to go deeper than the floorboards. She carried herself with the authority of someone who measured time in seasons, not train schedules. In her arms lay willow bark, sweet grass, a jar of something that glowed faintly like honey catching moonlight. "I am called Lily of the River by those here," the woman said in measured English. "My own people call me Mishawetu. It means the water shows a face." She smiled the kind of smile that makes a room exhale. "We heard your bell." Reverend Cray hesitated, doctrine whispering in his ear. Dr. Merritt did not. "We need everything good," he said simply. "Come in." Misha's eyes traveled the room, weighing and measuring. She set her basket on the table Zoya had turned into a pharmacy. "Brew this," she said, laying willow bark into Zoya's palm. "For fever and pain. Sweet grass for the air." She lifted the bruised stem to her nose and breathed in, as if scent could be sacrament. "And this," she tapped the jar of what looked like salve, "is for the skin that cries. Spread thin. Do not scratch. Tell the little ones stories, so their hands forget to itch." Zoya did as she was told. She poured hot water over willow and felt the room change its smell. She braided a length of sweet grass and laid it by the window, where the evening breathed it into the ward. She dipped 2 fingers into the salve and found it cool, made of fat and something resinous. When she smoothed it over a boy's wrist, he stilled as if he recognized a language he did not know he knew. "Thank you," Zoya said. It did not feel like enough. She tried another sentence. "Spasibo." Misha tilted her head. "What is that?" "My mother's word for gratitude." "Good," Misha said. "Gratitude is a medicine that travels without spilling." Harlan watched from the doorway with the expression of a man who had found a tool he didn't know he was missing. He took up the work again without a word, fetching water, closing shutters when night wind drafted too hard across hot skin, tearing Zoya's strips cleanly along the weave so they didn't fray fuzz that could irritate already angry bodies. By dawn, Zoya felt the hours as a weight hung from the inside of her wrists. She scrubbed her hands until the skin shone like peeled apples and scrubbed again. She drank water by instruction, as if it were a job, and when her body forgot to be thirsty, she drank anyway. She caught herself humming the lullaby she had heard through the boarding house wall, a melody that did not belong to her and somehow did. A small child smiled in her sleep, and Zoya took that as permission to keep singing. The days became a rope she climbed, hand over hand. The ward filled. The river camp sent baskets every morning, sage bundles and willow, a powder for tea, thin soups that tasted better than their ingredients.
Prudence Craig came at last, with her apron pinned like armor, and worked quietly as a stone. Tansy Bellamy sent a ledger page that read, "Delivered soap, soda, vinegar, flour," and beneath it in smaller letters, "Pray for my boy." Zoya wrote back with wet hands, "Your boy is brave, to give hope a place to sit." At the edge of everything, Sheriff Calder prowled, trying to be useful without becoming cruel. His idea of help had sharp corners. "We ought to close the road with fire," he said once, eyes flicking to the river camp as if fire could learn to swim. Dr. Merritt gave him a look that should have simmered a pot. "We close the road with watchers," the doctor said, "and with sense." Harlan moved like a hinge, from church to homes to the carpenter's shop he had turned into a place to build cots. He returned each night with sawdust in his hair and the soft look he turned only on Zoya. He carried the ring still, a warm weight in his pocket. He showed it to her one twilight after she had washed her arms up to the elbow and stood on the church steps to breathe unfiltered air. "I didn't know a ring could wait so politely," he said, and Zoya's laugh startled a bird from the cottonwood. "It waits because it wants to be worn on a day we will remember for reasons other than fear," she said, and felt the truth of it in the bones of her chest. In the second week, the work sharpened. The ward no longer held just fever and fear, it held decisions. Dr. Mary divided his time like a loaf too small, weighing where each slice could do the most good. Vaccination lines formed in the morning shadow. Some took it with the grateful fervor of those who had heard the old stories, a vaccine that had spared a generation. Others eyed the needle as if it were a snake that had learned to stand. "Faith, not vials," Reverend Cray overheard one man mutter, and he answered in a voice tired enough to be kind. "Both. God made room for both." Zoya learned the feel of a dangerous fever under her palm, how the temperature climbed not just on the skin, but underneath, a tide that pulled consciousness out like a tide can pull a child. She smelled when sweat turned too sour. She spoke in a voice that borrowed steadiness from Harlan's hands. She slept on a pallet in the corner with her dress strips as a pillow, and woke to the kind of intimacy you can only have with strangers, their breath in your cupped hands, their grief instructing you without syllables. When blisters came, raised and furious, Zoya spread Misha's salve with a careful hand and stories. She made up a tale about a saint who wore a dress that could become anything a town needed: rope for a bucket, shade for a chicken coop, sails for a toy boat, and once, this part made the children blink, the wing of a bird foolish enough to try to fly into a storm. "And bandages," a little boy with hair like thistle insisted, voice rasping with sleep. "Yes," Zoya said, touching his hot forehead. "Bandages most of all." "Saint," Prudence Cray said once, catching the word as if it had rolled under a bench. "Mind yourself." The warning in her voice was not jealousy, but a fear of names that grown too fast. Zoya dipped her cloth into cool water and wrung it out. "Names are only tight if they're too new. I'll on purpose not grow into any way of being I cannot carry." The town carried her anyway. Word travels faster than illness. Mrs. Keeler told the blacksmith, who told a rail crewman, who told a gambler, who told the barmaid, who carried a story like a tray. The mail-order bride who cut the dress off her own wedding day and turned it into mercy. Some stories grow teeth when they travel. This one grew wings. Men who did not cry, cried quietly. Women who had never liked Zoya's accent decided accents were a kind of music. In the river camp, children told the tale back to their parents with the embroidery children love. The dress glowed, the dress spoke, the dress lay over fever like a snowdrift that did not chill. Harlan did not listen to praise because he had a door to plane and a cot to deliver, but he watched Zoya the way a man watches the tide he works beside, respectful, alert to changes in current. He began to understand that love was not a lightning strike in night, but a steady voltage that made lamps burn without flicker. On a hot afternoon that had learned the trick of making shadows seem like lies, Harlan swayed in the doorway of the ward and put his hand to the jamb to keep his balance. Zoya saw it from across the room. The world narrowed to the square foot of air around his face. He smiled when he saw her looking, and the smile wasn't right. When he walked forward, his step was careful in a way that felt like deceit. He lowered himself to a bench, and the relief that crossed his face when he could be still was a terrible kind of confession. "Sit." Zoya said, as if he needed permission to do what his body had already demanded. She put the back of her hand to his forehead. It was not yet a fever, but heat stood behind his skin as if waiting its turn. "I'm fine," Harlan said, which is what people say when they are 2 rooms away from fine and moving in the wrong direction. "You will be," Zoya said, which is what people who only have the present to give say to make the present bearable. She wanted to put him in a bed and stand over him like a wall. She wanted to wrap him in the last strip of lace, as if lace could bargain with illness. She fetched water and watched him drink. She took his pulse, quick, with a thread in it. She told herself a story about how some men had bodies that liked to rehearse fear without performing it, and she told herself that Harlan was one. Bodies listen, sometimes, when told they are safe. At dusk, Misha returned with 2 young people carrying baskets nearly too heavy to be lifted. One basket held more willow, more salve. The other held something else, an assortment of plants Zoya had no words for, and a bundle wrapped in deerskin. For cleansing, for protection. Misha looked at Harlan, then at Zoya, and Zoya saw the moment when the older woman measured love not as romance, but as inventory. Who will be harmed by this? Who will repair it? Who will carry the heavier half? "Teach me," Zoya said simply, and Misha nodded, pleased with the economy of the request. They sat on the church steps under a sky that had gone the color of a bruise healing, and Misha showed her how to brew what she had brought, how little to use, and how to look for signs that a body would welcome or reject a medicine. "This is not your mother's kitchen, but you have her hands." Zoya blinked hard at that, eyes hot for a reason different from fever, and whispered the Russian word for mother into the side of her tongue so the air wouldn't take it away. On the 10th day, Zoya woke with her bones aching as if she had been filled with pebbles. She swung her legs from the pallet, felt the floor tilt, and then right itself with a small hiccup. There was no time to be anything but upright. She scrubbed and tied her hair back hard enough to make her scalp complain. She set her face into the expression that told fear she could talk later if she liked. Across the room, Harlan slept on a pallet, at a distance that felt right, close enough to see, far enough that she could pretend he was simply helping, not in a line gently moving toward trouble. His skin had the sheen she did not like. When she touched his wrist, his pulse looked back at her like a small animal in a snare. He did not wake, but his mouth moved as if tasting a word. She bent close. It was her name. He was not asking for water or God. He was saying Zoya like a man trying to keep a lamp lit in a room with drafts. "Rest," she said. "I'll be here." She stood, and the room slid again. She put a hand on the wall and breathed until the floor remembered its job. Mid-morning brought a crush. 3 new patients from the outskirts, a man from the rail camp brought in half against his will, and a girl of 8 whose father would not let her hand out of his even when Dr. Merritt needed to turn her on her side to help her breathe. Zoya moved with a precision that came from exhaustion, a clarity that sometimes only comes when all the usual noise has burned away. She cooled foreheads. She told the story of the dress again, quieter this time, like a secret passed along a chain only of those who would keep it safe. At noon, a shout knifed the air. Sheriff Calder's voice shot through with a panic he could not hide, cut across the ward. "Doctor, we've got men on the road from Cedar Fork. They're sick and they won't stop. They say the watchers are cowards." Dr. Merritt swore, a brief and honest word that seemed to sterilize the air it moved through. "We can't," he started, and then thought better of naming the thing he could not do. He grabbed his bag and went. Harlan stirred on his pallet, and Zoya felt the decision move through her like a line drawn on a map. She called to Prudence to keep water moving, to Misha's niece to keep little hands from scratching, to Tansy Bellamy, who had come without her apron this time and looked almost like someone else, to boil more strips. Then Zoya followed the doctor into the white-bitten glare of noon. They met the men at the edge of town, where the road narrowed itself from a gesture into a finger. The watchers, boys mostly, under their brims, held rifles that wobbled not from fear of shooting, but from the fear of not being believed wise enough to hold them. The sick men were far gone enough that shame could not touch them. They wanted water and air and a place to lie down without hearing their own breath. Dr. Merritt negotiated with something like love disguised as authority. He split them into those who could still walk and those who must be carried. He let one curse at him because cursing is sometimes the last language a man has, and he answered it respectfully because the dying deserve fluency. Zoya moved toward a man who swayed like wheaten wind, and when she put her hand under his elbow, his body recognized help and leaned into it. His breath smelt like iron and burrs in summer. She did not flinch. She bound a strip around his wrist where he had scratched himself raw. Her fingers were deft and kind. He looked at her as if he had pulled him from a river. "Saint," one of the watchers whispered behind her, not quiet enough. Zoya did not turn. Names could do harm if you tried to wear them the day you received them. She wrapped and lifted and wiped and felt every pound of each person in places that would ache later. She did not think of later. When they returned to the church, the room felt smaller, the air thinner. Zoya's head gave a hollow ring that was not a bell but could have been. She moved anyway, the way a dancer keeps moving after the music stops because muscle memory can hum on its own. She wanted to sit. She did not sit. She wanted to lay her face on Harlan's shoulder and admit that she was a woman, not a wall. She did not. She wrung a cloth. She put it on an old man's forehead, and it came away hot almost instantly, as if Hat had learned to multiply. She wrung again. She moved. Late afternoon hunched down into itself. The light cut slant and showed the dust in the air, each mote like a confession. Zoya stood at the window to breathe, and her breath came in little uneven stair-steps. She put her hand on the sill, and the wood felt less like wood, more like something that could be a boat in a pinch if the floor suddenly became river. She smiled at the thought, foolishness as medicine, and turned back to the room. Harlan opened his eyes. The blue of them had deepened to an ocean before rain. He did not look like a man who would make jokes right now. He looked like a boy who had learned that the world did not always bring you the thing you had ordered, but brought something heavier with your name tied to it. "Zoya," he said, and this time the word was a question. "Are you? Will you? Can we?" "I am," she answered all of it with 2 words and a damp cloth. "Drink." He tried and coughed, and the cough had a new sound, a thickening, a weight hung from the end of it. She lifted him with care that she knew would become desperation if she let it. He leaned into her, and she felt the heat coming off his skin like summer off a road. Somewhere in the church, a child cried in small barks that said, "I am old enough to know this is not how days should go." Prudence sang under her breath, and Zoya could not place the hymn, but recognized the shape of wanting deliverance. Evening slid across the floor. Lanterns bloomed one by one, small suns held by hooks. Zoya moved among them and felt sweat run down her back like a memory. She checked foreheads. She adjusted windows. She coaxed water past lips. She turned, and the room moved a fraction to the left without asking her first. She steadied. She told herself she was only tired. Tiredness could be slept down the way you sleep down a fever in a small child's body. Mija came close enough to make her presence known without startling. "You will sit," she said, and in her voice lived the certainty of rivers. 2 minutes. I will count. Then you will keep going. This is how we carry a long day. Zoya sat. She drank. 2 minutes arrived and left. She rose, steadier than before, grateful for how human bodies will listen sometimes if you speak to them in time. Close to midnight, when the room had learned the soft talk of exhausted people and even Prudence's humming had thinned, Zoya bent to tie a bandage around a girl's forearm. The strip was one of the last of the lace. It looped and lay against hot skin like snow melt on rock. Zoya's fingers worked the knot and then paused because a small pain had begun at the back of her neck and traveled forward like a weather front. She straightened. The room came with her this time, obligingly. She put the back of her hand to her own forehead the way her mother had done 100 times and found heat there that did not belong to the air. She told herself it was the lamps. She told herself it was the rush and effort and the way worry can pull the temperature up a half degree like a string. She bent again, finished the knot, and wiped the girl's wrist with a cloth. "Zoya?" Harlan's voice moved from his palate to her the way the river's voice moves tellingly around stones. It held fear, but also something else, a question she had promised to answer even before she had heard it. "I'm here," she said, without turning. Her hands found another strip, another jar, another knot. She felt her pulse in her fingertips, bright and a little too strong. She finished the wrap and reached to rinse the cloth in cool water. As she drew her sleeve back, the lantern caught the inside of her wrist. There, small as a seed, rose a single red-brown dot beneath the skin. No bigger than a pinhead, a punctuation mark written by a hand she did not invite. She stared at it as if staring could unwrite it. The dot did not care for her gaze. It remained, modest and implacable, the kind of fact that changes a room without noise. Heat walked up her spine to the base of her skull. Her mouth went dry and then flooded. She closed her hand slowly over the small new planet on her wrist, as if she might crush it with mercy. Across the room, Harlan coughed, a sound with edges now. Dr. Merritt straightened from another bed and turned toward Zoya, as if he had felt the air drop a degree when her heart did. Mija lifted her head and studied Zoya with the eyes of someone who can read weather before clouds know what they are going to do. Zoya took a breath that tried to break apart in the middle and held it together with will and a wordless prayer in a language older than her mother's. She lowered her hand to the basin, and the water looked back at her as if it, too, was waiting to see what she would decide to be next. The church door thumped lightly in a breeze that had learned to come at night with the tenderness the day did not have. Somewhere outside, the river spoke, and for once Zoya could not translate. She raised her eyes to the room where every lamp was a small sun and every bed a shore. She felt the heat in her skin, the small hurt at the back of her neck, the seed on her wrist that could unwrap the whole of her future. She set the cloth down carefully as if not to wake something that had already woken. Her mouth shaped Harlan's name and did not speak it. For the first time since she had cut the lace, she felt herself sway in the center like a tree that had grown tall enough to be asked a question by the wind. And then Zoya Markova, whose wedding dress had become bandages, whose hands had been a wall for other people's breath, looked at the pinprick star on her own skin and knew the next hour might decide whether she would be remembered for courage alone or for the stubbornness to survive her own mercy. She lifted her wrist toward the lantern light. The first shadows of the rash were beginning to rise.
She lifted her wrist toward the lantern light, and the light told no lies. The skin there had found a small star to grow, a pinprick, brown-red, the first punctuation in a sentence she had prayed would never be written on her body. Heat pressed behind Zoya's eyes. Her breath came as if it had learned stairs. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. She lowered her hand, not to hide the mark, but to keep from frightening the room. Panic was a second contagion and spread faster than any rash. Zoya folded the cloth calmly, cool, precise, as if she had been born with hands already taught for this, and set it in the basin. She could feel Dr. Merritt's attention like a physician's hand between her shoulder blades, steadying without touch. "Doctor," she said, voice pitched for him alone. He was at her side in 2 steps, the lines at his mouth deeper than morning's, eyes gone to that color a river takes when carrying too much. He looked once at her wrist and did not flinch, which Zoya recognized as the exact right kind of mercy. "When?" he asked softly, a question wrapped in 10 others. "Just now," Zoya said. "Heat since dusk, ache in the neck. I have been telling myself it was lamps and hours." She lifted the corner of her mouth in what wanted to be humor and didn't quite make the climb. "Hours are generous things. They take blame without complaint." Misha watched from her station with the salve and willow, her gaze the patient weight of weather. She stepped closer only when Zoya turned toward her, as if answering a summons neither had spoken. "You will not be alone," Misha said, not as comfort, but as fact. "We make a small room for you. Thin wall, thick listening. You will teach from it." Zoya's fingers tightened once on the basin's rim. "Harlan?" she asked, and hated how the single name felt like several, a plea, a duty, a geography she had walked into with no map but what she had drawn herself. Dr. Merritt followed her eyes to the pallet where Harlan lay, in a fever shallow waters, drifting, blue gaze turned inward, breath with a weight hung on its end. "He is early," the doctor said. "Not yet to the island where men forget their names. I'll set him separate. He will hear you through the wall. That helps more than most things I know." "I can still work," Zoya said, "through cloth, through space. I will not touch anyone who is untouched yet." She looked to Misha. "You will check me when I forget my own instructions." Misha's mouth curved. "I will scold you like a sister." Reverend Cray, who had learned to stand where he could help without the need to be seen, came with a roll of muslin, a few boards, and the look of a man who had read scripture long enough to know that walls are not only built to keep people out, but to keep love from spilling in the wrong direction. Within an hour, the rectory's anteroom had become Zoya's room, a doorway veiled by a sheet kept wet with vinegar, a small table, a chair, a basin, a window that watched the cottonwood and the thin brightness of stars. Prudence pinned another sheet across the doorway for good measure, and after fastening the last tack, kept her hand braced there as if the wall asked for the steadiness of bone. Zoya stepped inside and the sound changed, as if the room had different weather. She washed her hands slowly, precisely, as if the water was a clock and she could have more time by using it right. She tied her hair up again, even though not a strand had fallen, because order stilled the tremor in her. She looked at the dress strips folded like small clouds and felt a stitch pull in her heart. She had cut that dress to save strangers. Now she would save herself for the ones she loved. "Zoya!" Harlan's voice found its way through the sheet like smoke. She came to the threshold and did not cross it. On the other side, his outline was dark in the lamplight, and she could feel the heat of him as if heat could learn a language and speak through cloth. "I'm here," Zoya said. "Drink when they bring you. Sleep when your body forgets how. I will be in your pocket, same as the ring."
There was a rustle, he touching that small gold circle without needing to see it. "It waits," Harlan said, a smile tired and real baked into the 3 words. "It's good at that." The night stretched long and thin. Zoya measured it in compresses and in the sound of Misha's footsteps, in the steady traffic of the river's voice, in the 3 small notes the bell gave at intervals when a hand tugged the rope, as if to remind the town that hope rings too. The first shadow on her wrist raised itself into a low hill. More dots arrived with the stubbornness of seeds. In the morning, the watchers on the road invited a rumor to breakfast by bringing it to town. Cedar Fork had burned a house with the dead still in it. Not out of cruelty, the rumor insisted, but to keep the living safe. Rumors have a cruel talent for sounding reasonable when people are tired. Sheriff Calder paced the church aisle like a man trying to memorize a speech he did not want to give. "If it jumps the river, he said to Dr. Merritt. "We'll need—" He glanced toward the camp upriver, and the word he did not say burned the air around the word he tried instead. Measures. Zoya heard it through cloth and felt anger arrive in her blood like fever's cousin. She pushed it down. Anger could cut the wrong people. "Sheriff," she called, surprised by the strength in her voice. The room stilled, as if it had agreed ahead of time that when Zoya spoke, it would listen. "You will help. You will not harm. Those are the terms." Calder's hat brim lowered as if considering whether to argue with a woman who was a rumor herself now. He compromised by grumbling something about order and stepped outside where people could see him be a sheriff. Prudence's mouth twitched, which on her face counted as a grin. "Carry on," she told Zoya's curtain, and the blessing was better than any choir. Zoya set the day into lines. She spoke procedures in a voice without tremor and watched the room settle into them because order gives fear a place to stand and be counted. And once fear is counted, it sometimes goes home of its own accord. She taught Prudence how to fold a strip so the edge would not bite. She taught Tansy Bellamy to smooth salve with patience. She taught John John's grandmother to sing the refrain of a lullaby exactly when a child's hand began to wander toward blisters. Through all of it, she kept a ledger of the town in her head. Who needed water, who needed cool shadow, who needed someone to look at them as if they were still themselves. At noon, Misha made tea, whose bitterness tasted like a good truth. She set it on Zoya's table and touched her wrist with 2 fingers, respectful and firm. "You are brave, but there is no need to be a stone. Stones do not bend. We will bend and not break." Zoya nodded and let her breath be messy for 3 heartbeats. "If I break," she whispered, low enough that only the cloth could hear, "I want to break in the direction of love." The second day inside the sheet brought more stars to Zoya's skin. Her neck ached with the discipline of holding up a head that had become a heavier thing than usual. She moved more slowly, turned her instructions into short threads that others could tie into knots. Boil, cool, wring, do not scratch, tell stories, drink. She learned the names of water skins, the habit of counting out loud while washing, twice, 20 slow seconds. She made lists because lists make a future feel possible. Sheriff Calder returned with an audience at his back and trouble in his eyes. "Men from Cedar Fork," he said. "They're riding here to quarantine us themselves if we don't." He did not have words for the "if we don't," because every word he reached for burned fire round the word he tried instead. Measures. "The road has watchers," Dr. Merritt said. "They'll turn trouble away with the same hands they use to carry water." "Watchers are boys," Calder snapped. "You can't turn a mob with a boy." "You can," Prudence said, surprising them all. "If the boy is standing in front of a woman like me." Her apron was a flag of soap and resolve. She lifted her chin. "If those men bring fire to our road, they will feel the heat of our refusal first." Zoya let herself smile behind the cloth. "We do not burn," she said, and felt the sentence settle into the timber of the church like a law of physics. "We bind, we tend, we outlast." The vaccine cupboard held a truth like winter, a scarcity that clarified everything. Dr. Merritt laid the vials out on the table as if lining up a prayer. "Not enough," he said. "Not nearly, but some. Children first, then the watchers, then those who move between houses carrying water, then anyone who cooks, then the rest of us by age and risk." Calder bristled. "And me?"
The man blinked, unready for poetry in the mouth of a woman whose hair held feathers and whose eyes did not flinch. "We got our own doctor," he said, but the bluster had lost a button. "Good," came Zoya's voice, clear as water from behind the cloth in the doorway. Heads turned toward sound that had no body. "Let your doctor tend your houses. Ours will tend ours. If you bring fire, it will burn men you do not mean to burn. If you bring more fear, it will find children first. because fear is a low thing that travels close to the ground. "Who is that?" someone asked. "Zoya Markova," Prudence said, in a tone that suggested the name ought to be enough. "The bride," another watcher murmured. Even men from other towns had heard the new story threaded into the old, the woman who cut her dress into bandages and made the word vow wider. The riders looked at each other the way men do when the fight they had carried in their pockets begins to feel like a stone they don't want to skip across this river after all. The big man pulled his horse's head around and spat into the dust, an old ritual for backing down without saying the words. "You watch that church," he said to Sheriff Calder, which was as close to yielding as he could find. "You keep it from spilling." "We keep our own," Calder said, and in the saying found that he believed it. The riders left. The watchers exhaled. The cottonwood let go of a leaf not from season, but from relief. That night Zoya's fever rose, as if climbing a ladder it had made from her bones. She spoke instructions in a voice that now came from farther away, and the room leaned closer to hear. Set pots to simmer, count breaths, keep children's hands sweet with stories. When sleep took her, it was a sleep made of sawdust and riverlight and the rough comfort of a carpenter's shirt. She woke to the sound of Harlan saying her name. The room tilted toward him. She went to the cloth and laid her palm against it, as if that could transfer steadiness. "I'm here," she said. "I think I'm walking on a floor that doesn't know it's a floor. Every step is a question." "Then step with questions that have you in them. What is true? What is kind? And what is next?" He laughed, and the laugh sounded like someone striking a nail just right. "That last one is always the hardest." "Not here," she answered. "Here, next is drink, and then sleep, and then tell me something about a house you will build when boards are just boards again." He did. He spoke of a kitchen with morning inside it, even in winter, and of a door you could open with your hip when your hands were full, and of a little step so children could reach the bread. Zoya closed her eyes and laid those words like cool cloths on her own heat. On the 13th day, Dr. Merritt sat down without meaning to while drawing a line on his ledger. The line wandered, and so did his eyes. "Doctor," Zoya said, and her voice had the authority of a tide, "sleep. There are," she finished, "others to carry. You will give me an hour's worth of refusal, and I will give you an hour's worth of sleep." He made a sound that might have been a laugh if he'd had the energy. "Done," he said, and slept like a man falling into the only soft place left in a hard world. With him down, the ward's burden shifted onto fewer shoulders, and everyone felt the tilt. Sheriff Calder delivered pots with the care of a man handling ammunition. Prudence became three people somehow, her stern kindness like a loom making hours into cloth. Tansy Bellamy set a pie to cool on the church step for anyone who happened to pass and be human. Midge's niece, Awanita, braided children's hair to keep their hands busy and their scalps clean, telling stories about turtles and the way they carry their houses on their backs. By afternoon, Zoya felt the rash declare itself more boldly. Raised islands across her forearms, the geography of contagion mapped for anyone with eyes. She never liked maps. They made edges feel too hard. She turned away from her own cartography and looked instead at faces, that Mr. Finch polishing spectacles even now, at Millie whispering to God in a tone that suggested she had every right to be listened to, at the small boy with thistle hair asleep finally, fingers curled around the memory of not scratching. A crash split the air. Someone had knocked a lantern from its hook. Flame tossed itself toward the nearest curtain like a drunk lover toward a dangerous kiss. Prudence was there first,
smothering with a blanket that had, until that second, been Pelps's Sunday best tablecloth. Sheriff Calder arrived with a bucket, sloshed water that hissed. Triumph. The flame folded like a scolded child and guttered out. For a moment the room held its breath, as if remembering the rumor about fire and refusing to let it come alive. "Good," Zoya said, her voice rough. "We are faster than fear." Evening brought a different kind of blaze, heat lightning far off, turning the horizon into a page someone flipped again and again. The river grew louder. Midges stood in the door, face turned toward the upstream hills. Rain. Fast. "Flood?" Dr. Merritt asked, awake again and moving like a man who had walked out of a canyon and remembered he was needed above. "Maybe," Midges said. "Not like spring, but enough to change the voice of things."
It came at midnight, sheets of rain written slant across the town. The roof plasters sang with it. The gutters learned a new song. The river swelled and spoke in a register that pulled at bones. Water found the places it always looks for first, under doors, along thresholds, into basements where old jars waited with their lids too tight. "Up," Zoya said from behind her cloth when she heard the first drip under the church door. "Lift the pallets, put the children higher. Water is a careless nurse." They moved with the grace of people who had practiced moving in a dangerous room. Harlan sat up to help and nearly bolted with the world pitching. Mija's hand found his shoulder, and he stayed. Zoya directed, "Left, there, tilt that, brace this," until the ward perched above the first inch of river come visiting. The rain hammered louder, then relented as if remembering itself. The river moaned and then was quiet, which is the sound that makes people nervous because they cannot read it. In the morning, the air smelled scrubbed, which is always a lie after a flood. The watchers reported a road cut 2 miles out. The vaccine courier, if there had been one coming, would be delayed by mud insisting on its say. Zoya sipped weak tea and felt it sit on her stomach like good advice. Her wrist ached. Her mind stayed clear enough to count. When the courier finally arrived near sunset, he did so with curses and a mule that looked unimpressed by human urgency. He brought 2 vials wrapped in a sock and a paper with a stamp that said "Official" in letters that had never washed a child or buried one. Sheriff Calder signed something as if a signature could carry any of this. 2 vials, Dr. Merritt said, as if repeating the number might make it do a trick. He looked at Zoya through the cloth. "We keep the same order?" Zoya thought of children she could name in a line. She thought of the watchers, whose rifles trembled less now. She thought of the river camp and the way a child will always understand first when a thing is for them or not. "Yes," she said, "and one of those vials goes upriver." Calder reddened. "We keep what's ours." "The river keeps all of us," Zoya said softly, and her softness cut sharper than if she had shouted. "Half the fever broke here because of what they brought. A salve, a story, a braid of grass that made the room breathe better. You will not count their children as less." Prudence stepped between Zoya's cloth and Calder's temper. "Sheriff," she said, "you are a good man with a loud hat. Put it to use on the road and leave the medicine to people who have hands." He stared at her, startled into silence by the rare taste of her humor, and then, to everyone's surprise, including his own, he grinned. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and took his hat outdoors where it could do no harm. They made a ceremony of the injections, not because pomp heals, but because marks matter. The small circle the needle made now stood in for a larger circle, the one people were inside together. Zoya listened to the murmurs and let them work on her like cool cloth. The rash stippled her collarbone now in a pattern that looked almost like lace if you didn't know better. Harlan's fever climbed a stair and paused on the landing, undecided. He woke at dusk and his eyes found Zoya's shadow behind the sheet, as if the shadow were a star that knew how to stay in one place. "Will you marry me when I'm ugly?" he asked, and she laughed a sound that turned heads, because laughter had become a rare bird in that room.
I will marry you when you are dirt and when you are sunlight. Ugly is only a word people use when they don't remember that faces are maps, and maps tell how to get home. He reached for the ring in his pocket and held it up so it caught lantern light. This is a promise, not that life will be easy, that I won't leave the room just because the weather changed. Good, Zoya said, because the weather is a thing with its own opinions. Near midnight, the cough returned to Harlan with new teeth. It pulled at him the way a tide pulls at pilings. Dr. Merritt, who had learned the sound of when to be gentle and when to be fierce, sat at his side and counted breaths. Zoya counted 2 from behind the cloth, the numbers snagging on fear, but still making their way up the rope. "Breathe with me," she said, and Harlan followed her pace as if it were a road he trusted, one she had walked ahead and could mark with cairns.
In the hour before dawn, the one sailors respect and mothers fear, Tansy Bellamy's boy failed quietly. His chest simply decided it had done enough. Zoya heard the change in the room before anyone cried out. Silence is an instrument. It changes key. Dr. Merritt laid a hand over the boy's eyes like a benediction, and Prudence set the kettle off the boil because the sound was too jaunty for the new tone of the hour. Tansy made no sound at first. Then a sound came that Zoya recognized from every city she had ever lived in, every port she had ever passed. Human grief being born. It had variations in every language, but the shape of it was always the same. Zoya stood and went to the cloth as if it were an altar. "May I come closer?" she asked, and the room gave her the grace of a unanimous answer. She lifted the wet sheet just enough to step through and kept distance enough that her breath would not find another's mouth. She crossed to Tansy and knelt, every bone in her arguing and every bone obeying. She did not touch the mother. She set her hands palms up on her knees like a bowl ready to receive a poured thing. "Tell me his first word," she said softly. "Tell me the story of the day he wouldn't nap." Tansy told it, broken, halting, but told, and in the telling found a way to lodge the boy in the room where words stay. Others added pieces, the way he licked salt from his fingers and pronounced it sugar, the way he believed the dog could understand Latin, the way he once tried to sell his sister a jar of air and called it bottled sky. By the end, grief still lived in the room, but it had a chair to sit on and a cup of water in its hand. When Zoya rose, the world swung wide. Dr. Merritt's arm was there, a firm line under her weight, and the look he gave her was half anger, half gratitude. "Back," he said, "saints can sicken, and we need you to be alive more than we need you to be holy." The word saint touched the room like a spark that does not catch because all the wood is already wet. Zoya breathed once and stepped behind her veil again. She recognized the line she had crossed and told herself she would not cross it that way again. Rules are not cages, they are bridges that stay up when you are too tired to swim. At midday, the river camp sent a small carved figure with the soup, a woman with a bundle on her back and a child on her hip, both looking in the same direction. Awinta set it on Zoya's table. "She is called She Walks with Many," the girl said, pride and shyness braided in her voice. "For when someone walks with more than herself." Zoya touched the head lightly. "Spasibo," she whispered, and the word felt at home in the grain of the wood. Afternoon dragged its feet. The fever in Zoya's body asked for her attention the way a child tugs a sleeve. She gave it none she could spare. She taught a boy to count his breaths with river stones.
She corrected Sheriff Calder when he mistied a bandage and made him redo it until his fingers learned a gentleness that surprised them. She asked Prudence to hum again that note from her girlhood and watched it lay a hush over 3 cots at once. Then Harlan's breath stuttered. It skipped and then forgot and then raced to catch up, panicked. Dr. Merritt's hands were there. So were Zoya's words. In, she said steady. Hold. Out. He followed, as if held by a rope thrown across a chasm. Sweat glazed his lip. He looked at her shadow as if it were the only thing on the wall not moving. I'm here, she said, again and again, as if the sentence were a nail and she had infinite patience to drive it home. The storm at dusk was not on the horizon this time. It sat down on the roof and rattled it. Lightning stitched the sky. The church felt like a boat and Zoya like someone who had learned, finally, how to captain from a chair. Sheriff Calder came in soaked and cursing, then remembered where he was and changed the curse to a prayer in the same breath. Road's gone again, he said, and a tree took the line to the telegraph. We're a town on an island. Good, Zoya said, and when he stared, she added, then we will behave like people who live on islands. We will share, and we will not waste, and we will tell each other stories until the water lowers and the road remembers to be a road again. The night ran like a wound. Toward its small hours, Mija looked at Zoya in that precise way of hers and tilted her head toward the basin. You sit, you wash your own arms now. You let the water remember you before you forget yourself. Zoya dipped the cloth and found the gesture had become prayer without needing words. She passed the coolness over her face and ached with gratitude as if her own skin were a thirsty field. She looked at her forearms, raised, angry, mapped, and felt no revulsion, only a strange tenderness as if her body were a child who had fallen and needed a story to take its mind from the scrape. She slept then, a short fall into a deep well with water at the bottom the exact right temperature for forgiveness. When she awoke, the room had changed keys again. Harlan's breath had steadied, a metronome willing to be reliable. Tansy Bellamy's chair sat empty. She had gone home to lay her boy out with flowers that people brought unasked. Prudence had taken up the ledger, and her script was better than the doctor's. Every loop looked like an oath. Sheriff Calder sat on the steps in the gray light and polished his pistol absent-mindedly, as if a clean gun could keep a town on its feet. The watchers brought news of a wagon on the far ridge, more medicine, perhaps, or men with instructions. When it reached town, it brought both in the shape of a federal agent with a paper that had more stamps than sentences and a face that had never watched the river for sense. He said, quarantine must be enforced with stricter measures, managing to make the word must sound like a little king. Source of baskets and medicine and 1,000 kindnesses, Prudence said before any man could gather his words into a line. You can go up river and tell them yourself, and I will walk behind you to watch you forget your manners. The agent blinked, unused to a woman standing in the middle of a sentence he thought had been built for men. Dr. Merritt stepped forward. If you have vials, we will take them. If you have suggestions, we will weigh them. If you have orders that burn bridges, you can carry them back the way you came. Zoya felt anger rise, not a blaze, but a tide, seawater in a landlocked town. She stepped to the veil, lifted it enough that the agent could see only her eyes. We are not your story to simplify, she said. We are the one we are writing ourselves. The agent stared, registering the rash and the courage and failing to separate them. His hand strayed to his breast pocket for a handkerchief not to use, but for what it symbolized, civility. He found none in the square of linen or in himself. He left the vials and the stamped paper and walked out with his back stiff because he knew people were watching how he retreated. Evening fell like a witness taking notes. Zoya's fever climbed and then checked itself, as if persuaded by her voice. Children slept. Men watched. Women worked the way work becomes a form of prayer when prayer needs hands. Harlan woke and said her name in the tone he had used on the day they met, when all he knew to offer was shade in a careful voice. "I am here," Zoya whispered, and the words were new every time she said them, as bread is new every day, even if the recipe is old. She stood once more, meaning to drink, meaning to count the vials, meaning to ask Prudence to sit for 10 minutes and be allowed not to be in charge of anything. The room slid a fraction. Not dramatically, nothing anyone else would have noticed, just enough to make her reach for the table instead of the cup. She put out her hand. It found air. Her knees remembered to fold the way good timber does when it has been asked to bear too much and would rather bow than break. She sank without drama, a woman lowering herself to the ground as if to listen better, as if the floor had a secret it would only tell if she got close. Voices rose, a wave, then a hush as people remembered that quiet heals more than noise. Harlan's shadow moved behind the sheet, a dark echo of her falling. Dr. Merritt's steps closed the distance like stitches. "Zoya," he said, and the syllables were as fierce and careful as his hands. "Stay with me." She tried to answer, her mouth filled with the taste of iron and willow and the dust of boardwalks. She reached without thinking for the only object that had stayed exactly itself while everything else changed. Harlan's ring sat on the table, where he had made Prudence set it for her to see. It caught one last spark of lantern light and made it look like morning. She touched the ring with a finger that did not trust itself to be steady, and the world went very far away, like a river seen from a high ridge, all silver thread and uncatchable. The bell rope moved of its own accord, or because someone pulled it, or because the town had agreed a long time ago that it would ring when it must. 1, 2, 3 notes fell into the room like birds. Zoya heard them and thought wildly that they sounded like footsteps coming down the road. Help or ending she could not tell. The veil fluttered with a draft that was not wind. Her vision narrowed to the circle of gold, and then to the tiny seam inside the circle where Harlan had joined the ends together so well you could only see the join if you were the kind of person who looked closely while the world begged for haste. Dr. Merritt's voice tunneled toward her as if from the far end of town. "Breathe," he said. "In. Hold. Out." Zoya tried to obey. The light went soft at the edges. The church door swung wide as if the storm had returned or someone had arrived carrying news heavy enough to move wood. And Zoya Markova, who had turned her wedding dress into bandages and her fear into instruction, fell forward into a darkness that felt like water, and the last thing she knew was that someone spoke her name as if it were a vow, and a bell tolled once more, the sound hanging in the air like a bridge not yet crossed. The bell's last note thinned in the air like a thread pulled until it vanished, and Zoya fell into the dark the way a diver slips under ice, cleanly, without a splash, the world above sealing over as if it had never been. The darkness was not empty. It had temperature and movement, and a low music she recognized, the river speaking through stone. She reached for it as for a hand. A voice traveled down that water, her name shaped with a carpenter's care. Zoya. She followed the sound, and the dark loosened as if someone had cut a seam in it. When the light came back, it did so around the edges, lantern halos first, then the practical geometry of the ceiling beams, then the veil of cloth that made the doorway a pale waterfall. Her body felt far away and heavy, like a trunk left at the foot of a bed. Someone pressed a coolness to her neck. The coolness had a scent of pine and animal fat and a note like rain. Misha's voice arrived next, steady as a metronome. "Breathe in, breathe out. The world can wait between." Zoya tried obedience like a new stitch. The air came. Dr. Merritt walked into focus with his sleeves rolled, his face set to fierce kindness. Behind him, Reverend Cray stood in the door, a wet coat over his arm. He had been the one to throw the church wide. Into the aisle behind him crowded townsfolk with eyes like weather, watchers with rifles damp from rain, Prudence with her apron wrung half dry, Sheriff Calder dripping an apology from the brim of his hat without knowing how to say it in words. And beyond them, framed in the sudden brightness, a woman in a traveling cloak the color of bruised plums and a man with a crate. Strangers. "Dr. Althea Layton," the woman said, touching 2 fingers to her hat brim. The gesture was crisp and did not ask to be noticed. "State Board of Health. I got as far as the cut in the South Road, then came on mule, with vaccines." She tipped her head toward the man at her shoulder. "And this is Jory Pike, who has arms enough to carry crates and sense enough to follow instructions." Dr. Merritt blinked as one does when a prayer is answered too precisely to trust it first. "You're late," he said, and then, "Forgive me, you are exactly on time." Layton's gaze took in the ward, the makeshift cots, the children sleeping with one hand bandaged into a mitten against scratching. She smelled the air, willow, vinegar, labor, and nodded once to Misha, as if recognizing in the other woman a colleague who wore a different badge. "We'll need a corner. We'll need a ledger. We'll need someone who does not faint at the sight of numbers," she said briskly. "And we'll need the courage you've already got." Zoya's mouth tried to shape a welcome. The word broke in the middle and reassembled itself as a cough. Misha's hand was at her back, cool and firm. "You fell," Misha said, which was both true and insufficient, and therefore perfect. "Now you will stand again, but slow. We do not race the river when it is already running downhill." Harlan's shadow moved behind the sheet, the outline of his hand lifting as if the cloth might answer if he asked it a question. "I'm here," Zoya called, her voice a little threadier than she wished. "I haven't figured out the hinges by myself." The ward changed pitch when Layton and Pike set their crate on the table. Glass clink, straw rustle, the slick pop of a stopper drawn. Dr. Merritt's hands were quick and reverent. The vaccine was glycerinated calf lymph sealed from the world's dust. He counted vials like a miser counts coins and then pushed them toward the line Zoya had already made in her mind. Children, watchers, the ones who carried water. He met Layton's eye over the tray, and something traveled between them. Mutual weariness, mutual stubbornness, the recognition that people who try to keep others alive must be allowed to laugh later, or they will forget how. From her chair in the thin-walled room, Zoya watched the work and felt a kind of peace settle, a scaffolding put under a sagging hour. She had not known how much her body had been bracing until it could lean. She slept and woke by minutes, not hours. Fever came like weather, fierce noon heat, then the relief of shade, then thunder that only she could hear. In the lucid intervals, she taught across the veil. Fold like this, count the 20 seconds, tell Millie to hum on the down-breath. When delirium gnawed, she saw snow in the corners of the ceiling and realized it was lace. The memory of her wedding dress repurposed into clouds. She smiled at it because it was useful, even in imagination. The rash climbed its ladder across her forearms and collarbone, raised and angry. Each blister a letter and an alphabet her body would learn whether it wanted to or not. She did not look away. If these were to be her sentences, she would read them. "You will have a mark," Misha said, laying 2 fingers lightly on Zoya's temple. "We all do. It tells the world where we have been and did not drown." Zoya thought of the story she had told Harlan, that faces were maps, and found she did not mind the cartographer fate had sent. "I'll wear it, like wheat at the hem, quiet." The riders from Cedar Fork did not return with fire. The rain had wrung the fight out of them, and the rumor with it. What came instead was the federal agent again, soaked to the skin, the corners knocked off his paper by weather. He stood in the doorway as if expecting the building to salute. It did not. Prudence met him with a mop and the kind of attention that cuts through speeches like a knife through string. "If you've come to carry water, take off your shoes." He began, then stopped, baffled by a ritual he had not practiced. "I have orders," he said instead, and set a soggy envelope on the table. Dr. Merritt did not read it. He pointed the agent toward the line at the kettle. Misha handed him a towel. After an hour of doing what hands are made for, The agent found himself changed into someone who could be spoken with. He took off his hat to Zoya's veil like a man entering a sanctuary. "Ma'am, I did not understand what a town is."
"Few do until it breaks," Zoya answered kindly. "Or holds." By the time the storm cleared completely, the town had a new rhythm. Watchers with thermometers instead of rifles at the road. Mihoja's niece Awanita walking the line of cots with a story about how the turtle learned patience. Sheriff Calder moving heavy things and lifting light spirits by accident. Dr. Layton establishing a quiet corner where the most fragile lay and where she sat the latest because night will sometimes bargain if you put your best mind on its edge. Harlan's fever found a height and camped there. He slept under compresses Zoya had cooled herself, and when he woke, his eyes had the depth of a lake remembering winter. "You still there?" he would ask, and Zoya would set her palm against the veil, his hand mirror-pressed to the other side. "Always," she said, which is the most a human can promise and still be a human. One evening, when the sun put a coin of gold on the opposite hill and took it away again for the pleasure of the trick, Dr. Merritt sat at the foot of Zoya's door and leaned his head back against the wall. His hair had remembered to gray in the last 5 days, and he wore that fact like a garment that fit him unexpectedly well. "I took an oath," he said to the air, and perhaps to Zoya. "I thought it meant the same thing everywhere. Turns out it changes its clothes depending on the town." Zoya smiled into her sleeve. "And this town's oath has the voice of a woman who cut up her wedding dress," he said. "It has the hands of a carpenter, with steady breath and bad timing. It has a minister's back strong enough to move pews and a wife who enforces order with pins and pie. It has a camp upriver, washing fever from wrists and sending down salve like a secret that loves to be told. It has a sheriff who was born to shoot at problems and has learned the harder discipline, to stand between. So the oath fits. You are dressed properly, doctor." He laughed once quietly. "You are ill, and still you tidy the world with sentences." Her fever rose again after that, because illness has its own pride and will not always be coaxed by humor. Layton came in the deep night and sat where Mihoja usually did. A book on her knee she did not read. "Tell me," Zoya said, because in delirium the mind likes to pick up a thread and follow it to a knot it can understand. She did not tell a story about medicine, though Zoya would yet have minded hearing one. She told a story about rail lines, about how a family of 5 had walked clear from Kansas to a town that did not want them, and how the mother had said, very politely, that the town would have to make room. She said it in a voice like a saw blade, clean and exact and with compassion in the set of the teeth. By the end of it, Zoya's forehead had cooled a degree merely from the pleasure of listening to someone who owned her own sentences. At dawn, a drum of hoofs sounded on the road, and every heart that heard it lifted and then set itself in place. It was not riders come to argue. It was a wagon scissoring mud in sunlight, a banner damp and flapping, relief. On it, 2 boxes of dry goods, bandage rolls, a sack of good flour and another of beans, a crate of oranges, oh wondrous oranges that made the children gasp, and 4 vials that Merritt and Layton met as if they were friends returning from a far country. The fear curve in Ash River bent. That's how Dr. Layton put it when she and Dr. Merritt leaned together over the ledger. Cases slowing, recoveries outnumbering new beds, the ward's night song changing from a choir of labored breath to a thin duet. They did not say miracle because miracles ought not to be asked to carry what ours can. They said work and meant love. Zoya's delirium had one final bright flourish. A visitation from her mother who came in with a pot of boiling linens and the scent of soap made of lye, animal fat, and patience. "You have my hands," her mother said in Russian, and Zoya cried in that same language without moving her mouth. "And your own heart," her mother added, which is the kind of sentence that makes a life untangle. She woke to the sound of Harlan laughing. It was a shallow laugh. The body does not risk deep when it has been recently reminded of its edges. But it was laughter, and she would have crawled to it if her legs had forgotten. She did not need to. He stood in the doorway, the cloth lifted just enough that it thought itself still doing its job. His eyes were rimmed red, and startlingly blue, and perfectly alive. "We're due back to the church, you and I. I believe we left a sentence unfinished." "Several," she said, and made herself sit as if she had been born to be a queen in a chair, and not a woman with shaking knees. The days after that were like walking downhill after a long climb. Still work, but the kind that lets you look up. They kept the ward because illness is a trickster and likes to circle back. But they opened the doors each afternoon and let air practice being air again. People stood in the doorway with hats off, not to pray, but because it felt right. Mihoja and her family came each morning with baskets and left each evening with empty pots and hands that had done what hands are proud to do. On a day when the river lay like polished pewter and the cottonwood held its breath from sheer delight, Harlan set a small table at Zoya's doorway. It held a blue jar with 3 wild roses, a loaf of bread with a scar down the middle where the crust had split, 2 tin cups, and a circle of soft gold. Reverend Cray stood with his Bible open to a page that had been dried after rain and carried a topography of pucker that would never iron out. Prudence allowed herself to be beautiful by accident. No apron, hairpin not to intimidate but to honor. Dr. Merritt had a clean shaven for the first time in weeks and had the look of a man who pretends he is only here because his work needs him in the building. Mihoja leaned against the post, arms folded, eyes bright, her smile the kind people meet later in a memory and cannot remember who they were before it. Not in the sanctuary, not yet. The ward holds its own holiness. Here will do. His voice went softer. God hears as well at thresholds.
Zoya stood. This time her knees remembered the older discipline, to hold. She wore a plain dress of indigo cotton whose hem she had stitched the day before, each wheat stalk small and almost invisible unless you bent close. On her forearms, the new scars lay like a delicate map, raised, pale, a script she did not hide. Her hair was braided with a strip of sweetgrass Awinata had woven for her. She felt like a woman who had learned the content of her bones. Harlan's hands did not shake, or they did and did not mind. Zoya Markova, he said carefully, the syllables pronounced like a covenant. When you stepped off that train, I thought I had ordered a bridge over water. Turns out I got the water and the shore and the boat and the oars. His mouth twitched. And the tide. Mr. Quinn, she said, which made Prudence wipe her eyes because of how old courtesy can become new tenderness. I thought I was coming here to be safe, and then I walked into a room that needed me to be brave instead. You did not tell me to stand back. You learned to stand next to me. Reverend Cray cleared his throat, which meant he is about to stop being a man and start being his office. If you give vows, say them like you mean them and not like something said in order to get to pie. He lifted his Bible slightly, then lowered it. Pies later. Harlan took the ring from the blue jar because sanctifying ordinary things is how people lengthen their days. He slid it onto Zoya's finger. The gold knew the way. She felt the seam, the join he had made so perfectly you could not see it unless you were the kind of person who looks for where endings have been mended into beginnings. She looked. She smiled. I will not leave the room just because the weather changes, Harlan said, repeating the vow he'd made at her veil, making it public now so others could hold him to it. I will break if I must, Zoya said, and Prudence inhaled sharply, but Zoya continued, and when I do, it will be in the direction of love. Amen, said Reverend Cray, and also amen, said Dr. Merritt, who had rediscovered faith by another stairway and did not mind arriving through the kitchen. The town did not cheer. It exhaled, which is louder. Someone rang the bell once, not as warning, but as the punctuation that makes a sentence stand up straight. Tansy Bellily brought a pie. The crust was imperfect, and grief sat down beside the happiness and helped itself to a slice, because grief and happiness share a table more often than people admit. Zoya and Harlan ate bread and drank from cups that would go back to serving water in a ward. Prudence pressed a thin ribbon of lace into Zoya's palm, the last scrap no one had used because it was too narrow to be good for anything. "You can keep this one," Prudence said, as if giving someone a small kingdom. "It has done its service by being saved." When afternoon slid toward evening, a wind ran its fingers through the cottonwood, and everyone looked up as if at a signal. Mizza lifted her chin toward the river. "Come," she said, "one more blessing. The water knows how to witness." They walked down to the bank in a small parade that did not try to be one. Doctors and their ledgers, a minister with his Bible closed for once, a sheriff whose pistol sat quiet in his holster, children with new scars and old curiosity, women whose aprons had dried into stiff flags. The camp upriver met them halfway, women with baskets, men with a drum the size of a wheel and half the sound of a heart. Awinata ran ahead and took Zoya's hand as if it belonged to her. At the bend where the river widened briefly as though remembering an ancestor and honoring her, they circled. Mrs. spoke first, in Lakota, then in the careful English she saved when she wanted words to be bridges, not fences. "We say thank you to the river that said no to fire. We say thank you to the hands that were water. We say this woman's name the way we say dawn." She said it. "Zoya." The sound sat on the water and did not sink. Reverend Cray surprised himself by not preaching. He set his hand on his Bible, then took it off. "We are people," he said simply, and the understatement felt like a strong beam laid across a gap. "We forgot for a while. We remember again." Dr. Merritt added only one sentence. "We'll have scars. They will not be all we have." Harlan dipped his hand into the river and flicked a little water toward Zoya's sleeve with the solemnity of someone who has learned not to waste. "For after," he said. Zoya reached into the blue jar she had carried down and took out the little carved figure Juanita had sent, a woman with a bundle on her back and a child on her hip, both looking the same direction. She set it on a flat stone where the next rain would find it and perhaps take it and perhaps not. "Walk with many," she whispered, and then again in her mother's language. The river took both words with equal courtesy. Summer tilted into its second half. The ward thinned until it was only a room with 3 cots and then one, and then none. The church remembered what it had been built for and became something larger without changing shape. People resumed the habit of crowding, at the store counter, on the boardwalk, at the edge of news. Sheriff Calder used his loud hat to keep sun off an old woman and began to suspect he had found his true calling. Dr. Layton wrote her report with a pen that had seen too much and took pleasure in the way ink obeys without drama. She left with her crate almost empty and her pockets full of paper thanks she would never throw away. The federal agent stayed a week past his orders and learned how to wash a floor without insult. The camp upriver remained longer than usual, and no one used the word encroach. Traders traded, children swapped games, stories braided and rebraided until they were unbreakable rope. On a morning when fog sat on the water like a shawl and refused to move until the sun asked politely 3 times, Zoya and Harlan walked along the bank hand in hand. He carried a basket. She carried nothing and felt radical about it. "You're different," he said conversationally, as if remarking on the sky. "Yes," she said, and smiled. "So are you." "You wear your scars like children," he said. "They are not a secret. They are not a weapon. They are a story you tell when the story asks to be told, and otherwise you keep them fed and clean and not in other people's way." She laughed and then covered her mouth because laughter had become, if not rare, at least something to be portioned with the same care as sugar. "You make good sentences when you're well," she said. "I had a teacher," he said. "She makes me say them out loud." They sat on the bank and ate bread that had to be torn with both hands and oranges that made their fingers sticky and their mouths bright. "I will make a table like this," Harlan said, looking at the flat rock, "with a dent on purpose for the bowl so it never wobbles when you stir. I will stain it with tea and camphor and herbs and call it holy, and I will sew a runner for it that has wheat at the edges and a stain no one minded to wash because work sat on it." "Children?" he asked, not because he was impatient, but because naming a thing invites it more kindly than hinting. "We'll see," she said. "I'm not in a hurry. But in the meantime, we'll walk with many." She gestured upriver where Awanita and the thistle-haired boy were teaching each other to skip stones. "The world will be the size of this bank and all the way to the place where the fish turn around, and nobody knows why." When they returned to town, Tansy Bellamy had her shutters open and a table set under one of them with 6 jars labeled "Air" in her son's careful printing. She left them there on purpose, and when people asked, she said, "The sky belongs on shelves sometimes." She grieved in a way that let others set their own jars beside hers without feeling foolish. Grief sat at her table when it needed to and got up to help with dishes when it could. In the fall, a new sign went up on the church. "Keep clean. Yes. Keep kind. More." Beneath it, another smaller. "We do not burn." Sheriff Calder pointed at that one with his hat when a stranger asked directions as if it told them more than a map could. It did. Zoya turned the front room of the carpenter's house into a place for mending that was not only cloth. People came with sleeves and questions and left with both stronger. She kept a jar of willow by the window and a jar of oranges when the wagon came, and a little tray for rings when fingers swelled from work and needed to remember they belonged to hands, not to vows alone. When anyone called her a saint, she shook her head gently. "The saint is the dress," she said. She gave herself to a town and then became stories. "I am only the woman who cut." But stories have their own habits. They put halos where they were only lamps. They mistake discipline for divinity. Zoya let them do their harmless work in the world and did her necessary work in rooms that smelled of soap and wood and the faint, pleased salt of sweat. She liked the afternoons best, when the light made the scars on her arms look like tidy rows of wheat in a long field. Winter came and was less cruel than the one in her memory. People had practice at sharing by then. The telegraph line learned to stay up when wind talked loudly. Mail arrived with its old momentum, and with it a letter in a careful hand from Cedar Fork that said, "We were wrong. Thank you," in a handful of signatures. Prudence framed it and hung it in the hall near the ledger as if it were scripture that had decided to apologize. It did. On a morning that did not know yet whether it would be snow or sun, and so tried on both, Zoya walked past the church and found Reverend Cray staring at the empty ward with his hands in his pockets, a posture that looked borrowed from Dr. Merritt. "It feels larger now that it's not full," he said. "That's because you know what it can hold," Zoya said. She stood with him for a while and let the room be itself in their company. "We could keep one cot ready," she suggested, "so the town remembers that help always has a place to lie down." "Theology by furniture," Cray mused, pleased. "I will credit you in the sermon without saying your name." "Good," she said. "Then you can speak longer." He laughed and pretended offense, and then unpretended, because not all habits are worth retrieving once put down.
Spring arrived in a flare of green so sudden people went out to the edge of town to watch it the way they watch trains, just to be part of the movement. Harlan built the table with the deliberate grace of a man who understood that wood has a past and should be spoken to with respect. Zoya stitched curtains that softened the window's insistence on being a square and taught Prudence to make the wheat stalks at the hem so that she could see her sewing sharpen the world too. Dr. Merritt and Dr. Layton returned to their own circles. She wrote them letters and they answered with news that the board had added a line to its recommendations, "Listen to women with salve." On the first anniversary of the day the bell tolled 3 notes and the doors swung wide, they all walked to the river again. Awanita had grown 2 inches and a precise vocabulary and corrected the sheriff's pronunciation of her name with cheerful authority. Tansy brought a jar of air and opened it so the sky could remember itself. Someone carved another figure to stand beside She Walks with Many, a man with a square and a ring in his pocket and a carpenter's smile that fit around grief. They set both on the stone together to face the bend where the river remembers. Zoya stood with Harlan while water carried a glittering line down the middle like a seam, so perfect you would only see it if you cared to look. "This was not the life I ordered," she said with contentment that surprised her. "Me either," he said. "Better. Harder," she added, because she owed the truth a nod, even on days of sweetness. "Yes," he said, "but sweeter for the salt." They walked home the long way, which is to say they stopped when people called out and allowed themselves to be interrupted by children and by birds arguing philosophy above the cottonwood and by Prudence, who insisted they look at her new hem even if they did not care about hems. They cared. That night, with the lamps turned low and the house breathing like an animal asleep, Zoya took the small last scrap of lace Prudence had given her from the jar on the shelf. She threaded a needle with the very finest silk and stitched it into the inside of the curtain seams where only she would know it lived, a secret mercy sewn into a house that had learned to be brave. When she finished, she kissed her fingers because old countries teach you that some blessings are supposed to pass through the hands. She lay down beside Harlan. He turned in his sleep toward her the way a flower turns toward a window, and the sight loosened something in her that had been tied for months. She slept without dreams because the day had contained them all. Morning woke them with the sound of children on the street and a wagon complaining in a rhythm you could dance to if you were the sort to dance while sweeping. Zoya rose and set the kettle on as if setting kettles on were the way the world begins each day. She tied her hair back and did not tie her sleeves because the scarred map on her arms had stopped needing permission from sleeves to be seen. Letters came on the afternoon train, one from a town 2 valleys over asking if she would tell them how to set up a ward in a church without ruining the pews and a marriage. She wrote back in neat hand, "Start with the pews. Marriages will follow if you keep water boiling and your voices low. Include the camp on your river. Do not burn." By evening, a breeze carried the smell of oranges from the store and the dry, bright secret of sawdust from the shop and the after-song of a hymn Prudence had taught children to sing while washing. Zoya stood in the doorway and listened to her town practicing being alive. Harlan came up behind her and put his chin on her shoulder in a way that made both of them taller. "2 more lessons you haven't taught me yet," he said, sly and soft. "I can feel them in the room." Zoya considered. "Patience," she said, "and joy." He sighed contentedly. "I was hoping for pie," he confessed. "3rd lesson," she said, "pie." They laughed. The river answered with a sound like a secret told to friends who can keep one. The bell, remembering its better use, rang once far off to mark a sunset no one needed a warning about. Far upriver, camp smoke rose in a straight, pleasing line. Down the street, a boy tried to sell jars of air to people who had learned to buy them when needed. Zoya closed the door on the night and turned the lamp up a little, then a little more, as if teaching light to be brave 1 degree at a time. The room brightened. It held. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.